weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I am joined by our professor of law, Ken Katkin, at Chase Law School. Ken, welcome to The Politics Guys.
Hey, Trey, it's great to be back.
Yeah, and we're doing things just a scooch differently today. Ken and I are recording this on Thursday, June 6th, which means that we're actually recording on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Yeah, that is that it didn't even happen 1944. Ken, it's weird to think because just last year I lost my last grandparent, and my grandfathers fought in the war, and nothing makes you feel older than recognizing that I am now the age of my parents when I was thinking about and getting all the stories from my grandparents, from their portions of the war, and 80 years ago, that's a long time.
Yeah. Did you see this news story about this flight? Like a bunch of American living veterans who landed at D-Day 80 years ago, which means all of them are at least 98 years old. A whole airplane full of them just flew over there to be back on that beach at Normandy this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine what that feels like. I also know the other really unique thing that people don't think about was, we still had segregation during World War II. And it was just a few years ago that we had our first black service members who received awards for that. And this year, a fourth black service member who is now deceased since 2005 will be the last individual, or at least posthumously, the last individual to receive a World War II commendation.
Yeah, in fact, the segregation even extended to, we had Japanese American units fighting in Europe, not fighting in the Pacific War, but so they segregated out like the African American units and the Asian American units and all that. But I think it did contribute to the civil rights movement in this country afterwards, the fact that African Americans had served with distinction in the war.
For sure, for sure. As a matter of fact, my paternal grandfather, I think he brought home one of the most unique things. He did not like talking about the details of it all the time. He fought in the Pacific side. And his takeaway when it was all said and done, and I'll never forget, he said this a couple of times to me. He said, the average person wouldn't shoot the average person no matter what their ethnicity is or no matter their origin. He said the problem is you get people in charge who are terrible. And so he chalked it up to, a lot of people had to kill each other as a result of leadership. And I've always thought that is a point of view that we don't think about often. But anyway, I'll save that. Any last little, D-Day thoughts, Ken?
Well, I'm glad that war turned out the way it did.
Indeed. I'll give us one last one, and that is since the end of World War II, there has been no major ground offensive, of course, until our most recent part of a lifetime with Ukraine versus Russia, which really kind of puts that in historic context.
No major ground offensive in Europe, you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I guess in the Pacific it wasn't quite over because there was the Korean War and the Vietnam War, but but in Europe, I guess that's right. Not a major ground offensive. And well, I guess the Russian troops moved into some of the Eastern Bloc countries in the as late as didn't the Soviets invade Czechoslovakia as late as the 60s?
You have almost kind of a bloodless take, but generally speaking, historians do not include that in their go because you don't have open conflict.
Right, no conflict. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, but it's just a movement and not a conflict.
Right.
Maybe we're splitting hairs, but that is
but
what
I think that's right. The kind of really, deadly fighting. It wasn't seen in Europe until the recent Ukraine war.
Yeah. So 80 years, and it'll be. I don't know. I was thinking about it. I'll be 60 because I actually fall on the deal. I'll be 60 when the 100th comes around. So, but we should move forward, Ken, and talk about the here and now for a moment, because this isn't the History Channel. This is the Politics Guys. Although even the History Channel is not the History Channel anymore. But here on the Politics Guys, what we're going to be starting with today is Biden's immigration executive order. This past Tuesday, Biden unveiled a new executive order authorizing U.S. immigration officials to deport large numbers of migrants without processing their asylum claims, announcing what is arguably the most restrictive border policy by a Democratic president in modern history. As he put it, if an individual chooses not to use our legal pathways, if they choose to come without permission and against the law, they'll be restricted from receiving asylum and staying in the United States, end quote. Now, this changes the policy that had allowed migrants on American soil to request humanitarian protection, even if they crossed the border illegally. Now, I am, in fact, a presidential scholar. This is my order. And one of the first things I noticed, Ken, was this is not actually an executive order. It is an executive proclamation. And we're talking about some interesting hair splitting that goes on here. Those are two very different things. Executive orders, they are all about creating, as a matter of fact, law. They have the force of law. Founded on the authority of the president, derived from his or her Article 2 constitutional reading. And so they just kind of go in. And one of the things that makes them unique as a result of that is because of that, they are published in the Federal Register and in the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, proclamations, on the other hand, generally do not have the force or effect of law, and they don't direct government officials or agencies to take particular actions under the Constitution. They generally deal with more ceremonial goes, but President Biden didn't end up doing that. And I have to be honest, this set off a lot of I had some flashing lights asking myself, why might this be the case? Why is he putting this out as a proclamation? And Ken, I'm going to float something a little, you oftentimes float legal things. I'm going to float a little bit of presidential policy. I think that Biden is putting it out as a proclamation because, as his earlier remarks had noted, he doesn't think he actually has the authority to issue an executive order like this. And so it's actually more of a proclamation. So I don't know. I'm curious, A, what you think about the policy itself, and B, I'm curious what you think about the fact that he does it through the device of a proclamation, if you thought about that.
Well, I hadn't thought about it until you just said it, but I don't think that there's a huge amount of legal significance in this case to the distinction, because the type of executive orders that I think you were talking about that would be published certainly in the Federal Register, I don't think they are always published in the Code of Federal Regulations, but perhaps sometimes they are. They usually
they're actually required by congressional law. If you have an executive order, they have to be published. Yeah, that's a
in the Federal Register, yes, but I just wasn't sure about the Code of Federal Regulations.
So everyone for the Federal Register, but if it applies then into the Code of Federal Regulations.
Yeah, that's what I was saying too. If it applies, but it doesn't always apply because there are statutes that Congress enacts that call for some kind of presidential role in implementation or interpretation. Oftentimes, this would be calling for a rulemaking that would come from an executive agency, not directly from the president.
But the president can kind of reach down into that agency through an executive order and pick those items. That's often what's happening.
Yeah, an agency typically, would pay a lot of attention to what the president tells them, but they also would have to have an open and public rulemaking process where other members of the public could weigh in with comments and, sometimes make arguments that whatever the president is asking for is actually illegal or contrary to the statute. And so the agency doesn't always follow the president's executive orders in those contexts, but they usually do if they can. And here I just think there's no particular statute that calls for, requires, or even invites an order like this. So there's not an easy way to slot this in. to the sort of ordinary framework of executive orders. And I think what it really is, probably if you just think about what legal status does this order have? It's really just the president's directive to executive agencies about his enforcement policy. It's really about enforcement policy rather than about the meaning of laws. And so I think in that sense, it doesn't have to be an executive order. It will get followed. And it's probably less vulnerable to to legal challenges based on procedural arguments. There's certainly going to be legal challenges about whether on the merits it's lawful or not. But I think the idea that he didn't comply with the Administrative Procedure Act, there wasn't a public notice and comment period, things like that would be problems if he tried to issue it as an executive order that had the force of law.
I think you're absolutely right. In other words, I think in short, he recognizes what he's doing is a breach of what he can actually do. And he himself even said that earlier in the process when Republicans shot down effectively this, not good reasons, but they shoot it down. He said, look, I can't take action on this. And now he's shifting. And that's, I think you're absolutely right. That's why he's using his proclamation. He recognizes that this is a smoke show for an election.
Yeah, I don't think it's just a smoke show because I think
it's illegal.
It may be illegal.
He can't do what he's doing, and that's why he's picked a proclamation. I mean, Biden is not. I mean, his office is not dumb on that front.
Well, no. Actually, I don't think that's why he picked a proclamation, though. I think that by picking a proclamation, he actually makes it easier to defend in court than if he made it an executive order. Like there would be
right because he can say effectively, "Look, this is not lawmaking. Yeah. I'm not really forcing these agencies to do anything." Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He is trying to use a very specialized device to allow him to state more than he can actually do, and therefore be able to defend that action by saying, well, I'm not really forcing anybody to do things that I don't have presidential power to do.
Right. I think it's going to be a close question whether the courts strike it down or not. I wouldn't predict one way or the other on that, but I think that it sort of shifts the question of legality to instead of being about the procedures by which he promulgated this document, where because it's a proclamation, it's kind of informal, so there's not as many procedural requirements about what he needs to do to promulgate it. So I think he does definitely make it harder to challenge on that ground, but it's still going to be challenged on the more primary ground that the order is not consistent with the asylum laws, right? That
exactly. We need to get that too.
He's trying to turn away. Yeah, he's trying to turn away asylum seekers who have a legal right under the asylum statute to come in, and that I think courts will take seriously. I mean, in the past, these cases have come up a lot in the Ninth Circuit, particularly when Trump did similar things, and the Ninth Circuit has consistently ruled against these kind of attempts by presidents, primarily President Trump, but now it'll be Biden, to do what those courts saw as violating the asylum statutes. But if it comes up in the Fifth Circuit instead of the Ninth Circuit, it could easily go the other way. So I think, the venue where this gets challenged is going to be extremely important to the outcomes here.
And I think we have to think about this as a totality as well. And this is something that I deal with in my discipline. And one of the things that President Biden said in his remarks is he had to do this because, quote, moving past Republican obstruction and using the executive authorities available to me as president to do what I can on my own to address the border, end quote. And this is a reoccurring problem structurally that we want presidents, or presidents think that they have to bypass the normal order of things in order to get things done more rapidly. And this leads to what we think of as being, kind of, there's a couple of different terms from it, but presidential rule is what you might think of it as a layman, kind of as overall. And we see this happening and again, no matter the party that's in power, they always want to push this. So what are your feelings as a Democrat Ken, for me, I'm continually frustrated when, Republicans, as a matter of fact, there's this really great book during the Bush administration on why we should have issues with the Bush administration's expansion of executive powers. And here you have, then we have obviously Barack Obama runs against that, against Hillary Clinton, and then comes into office and does exactly the thing he says he's not going to do. And now you have Biden kind of doing a similar thing here. And not only that, though, he is taking a position that, as I think you kind of noted a minute ago, almost could have been written by the Trump administration. So, what do you feel on it, both on that structural issue, but also on the content of it? As you already noted, this is a direct violation of a lot of asylum law.
Yeah, I think the general tenor of it could have been written by the Trump administration. It's a bit more humane than anything that the Trump administration did because it has a lot of exceptions and exemptions. It doesn't apply to unaccompanied immigrant children. It doesn't apply to victims of human trafficking. It doesn't apply to people who have visas. It doesn't apply to people facing serious medical emergencies or threats to their lives. And it actually doesn't apply if the numbers go down. So it has some numerical ranges where if the number of crossings at the border get, I think, below 1,500, then the order just expires.
But to be clear, yeah. That we haven't hit that number for the entirety of the Biden administration.
Right, that's right. I think it's what's like 3,500 a day now or something.
Yeah.
And the number in here is 1,500. So that's right. But I'm just saying it is a little more in those ways. It's probably more modest than what a Trump administration would have done. But it's the tenor. I agree with you is the same. It's trying to take away rights to asylum that asylum seekers have under statutes that Congress has enacted. Asylum seekers have these rights, and this is an order that, at least in some cases, is going to deny those asylum seekers of the legal rights that they've been granted under statutes that have never been amended. So I do agree that that's a problem. I think I do think a court probably should strike it down, just as the Trump efforts were struck down. Mm-hmm. I'm not predicting that will happen because I think it depends a lot. These days, the judiciary is getting a bigger and bigger percentage of it. I think is following the lead of the Supreme Court and becoming partisan. And I think partisanship is going to really determine whether the court strikes this down or not. Which is unfortunate. I agree with you on the merits. It probably should be struck down. But on the other hand, I would push back a little bit on what I think might be an oversimplification in your general point about the relationship between lawmaking and law enforcement. And I think it's more fluid than the way you described it. And kind of a simple example that I'll give would be, if you drive on the interstate highways and you see the speed limit sign that says 65, and you see, a lot of traffic going 70 or 75 and not getting tickets, you could ask the question, well, does that mean that the police officers have actually taken upon themselves to change the law that the legislature enacted, right? That the legislature enacted a 65 mile an hour speed limit and the police have just decided that 65 means 75. So, is that executive lawlessness? Is that authoritarianism that the executive branch is applying a different law than the one that was enacted? And I think, a kind of commonplace way to look at that situation would be to say, well, it's not that they changed the law, it's just that they're constrained by some practical realities about how they can enforce the law. And so they're sort of conserving their enforcement resources for people that are, driving the fastest, rather than just randomly picking some people who are going 66. And that would mean that traffic stop that policeman's not available to pull over someone that's going 100, And so I think a lot of law does work that way, where the relationship between the enforcement of law and the enactment of law ends up giving the enforcers some role in constructing the real meaning of the law. And so I do think it's an oversimplification to just say, well, the law is the law, because it's unenforceable just because of the resource constraints. We would need 100 times the number of Border Patrol officers that we have to sort of stop every illegal crossing. And so there do have to be judgments made about enforcement priorities, and that is going to involve imperfect enforcement of the law.
Now, I hear that, but there is a long line of scholarship that suggests that is not the primary action. That's the primary action of agencies, but not the primary actions of the executive office of the White House, who is attempting to make policy. So, for example, even here, we don't have to veer even from the current case with Biden. It's not as if what Biden is doing here is an attempt, kind of like in your analogy, to get fewer individuals. As a matter of fact, this is going to take more resources to do what he is suggesting here in his proclamation than it would otherwise. And again, I'm not ascribing that particularistically to Biden, but to suggest that as a pattern, what makes the contemporary presidency a contemporary presidency is the use of unilateral executive actions like executive orders to do things when they are unable to get them done through the normal channel of constitutional government, which has in fact expanded presidential power significantly from the era of Ronald Reagan until today. And then for that, when you think of it, not the contemporary, but then the modern presidency from FDR, who of course uses executive orders extensively, including, we were noting about D-Day, things like interning American citizens. So again, I mean, I'm not trying to pick on any particular presidents here, but just to say that this follows that larger pattern of behavior of an expansion of presidential power that begins in the modern era, and might, I would even argue, accelerates in what we consider to be the contemporary or the Reagan and forward era.
Yeah, just two responses on the resources. I do believe this order will take less resources, not more resources, because the very reason that there's this, if you want to call it a border crisis or even just a backlog, is because the under-resourced part of the asylum process is the judges who can hold the hearings on asylum, right? So it does take a lot fewer resources to turn people back at the border, which is what this order is going to do, than to process them through asylum hearings, which is what the statutes would require. And this is a kind of triage to conserve resources, because there's not enough resources to actually conduct all these asylum hearings. The other thing I would say about agencies versus the president, I was interested to hear the way you put that should be the agencies, that shouldn't be the president, because
I'm just saying that is where those motives are ascribed. I'm not necessarily right.
Well, yeah, but I think you were saying that if there had to be resource allocation decisions made about how an agency should expend its resources, weren't you saying that more properly should be made within the agency than by the president?
No, what I'm suggesting is that the motives, when the executive office of the president generally gets involved in kind of what we think of as kind of reaching down and touching agencies in particularistic ways, it is often related to particular policy reelection goals, and not generally. In other words, as kind of is famously stated in his overview of the president can't touch and look at everything all the time. And his executive orders are generally designed to be ways to bypass when he has lost. So he's kind of narrowing and focusing in on a particular agency to bypass what he has lost in another venue.
Yeah,
so I'm not arguing that obvious presidents are the top of the of agencies and ought to be able to have those kinds of controls. The question becomes, kind of as a scholarly empirical practice, when and why do they involve themselves, and to what extent do they attempt to circumvent? In other words, to what extent is it what you're suggesting, which is management of law enforcement at kind of a police level? And at what extent is it an attempt, in the words of some scholars, to have policy by other means when you've lost policy via Congress?
Right, but there's kind of two very live debates within administrative law that are affected by relevant to things you just said. So one, the Chevron doctrine, which has been the dominant doctrine in administrative law for the past 40 years, although it might be ending this term with the Loper-Bright case, but so far it hasn't ended. The Chevron doctrine actually holds that it is proper and appropriate for presidents with policy agendas to use the agencies to advance their policy agendas to the extent that the laws are ambiguous, right? No, not beyond that.
And that's the $100 question, though, right? So are you specifying ambiguity? And again, this is what presidential scholars oftentimes say. Are you specifying ambiguity, or are you, as a matter of fact, attempting to expand that ambiguity in ways to allow you, right? That's always the
so I get
absolutely
that.
true. Absolutely true.
Yeah. So right. So I mean, I think there's part of that we're completely in agreement on, but part we might be in slight disagreement on. So the part we're completely in agreement on is that if the law says one thing, the president has to follow the law. The president can't just say, well, I'm not going to follow the law. I'm going to put my policy.
And there's some level of ability to negotiate around that. In other words, as you're talking about, right? But the question becomes, but what if you only pull over? Maybe you use your example. What if you say, well, I'm going up for re-election and I need more votes. So I'm gonna direct the sheriff. We're only gonna pull over people who are going 110 in 65, right? I think that might be the way to kind of add on to your analogy there.
But the Chevron doctrine, though, does hold that in the actual federal government that we have, where Congress has passed a lot of statutes that give agencies broad powers and broad responsibilities and are not super specific about a lot of things. And in fact, most of these agency statutes have languages that say have language in them along the lines of, the agency has the power to do things that are useful and convenient to achieve its goals, and things like that. You have broad language like that in there. Under the Chevron doctrine, the court has said that if there are questions about whether, borderline questions about, what does the agency have the power to do or not have the power to do, the agency itself gets deference in answering those questions. So, and by the agency, we really mean the president, because the agencies are part of the president's administration. So Chevron has legitimized to a very broad extent, again, within the boundaries of, if there's more than one possible answer under law, that the president gets to pick the answer among that range of reasonable alternatives, and he gets to pick it for reasons that are political or that relate either to his electoral politics or to his policy agenda. That's valid. The other thing I would say is that the modern Supreme Court, in a line of cases that I mostly disagree with, but
now when you say I'm not trying to split a hair, but this is an honest question. When you talk about the modern Supreme Court. Explain that for myself and listeners, because obviously as a presidential, we oftentimes think Reagan forward, contemporary, FDR forward, modern. But I think when you use the word modern, you're actually meaning even more recent than that.
21st century. Right. So Chevron is a doctrine that comes from the 80s and I think was intended to sort of summarize some antecedent doctrine that was older. But I'm not calling that modern because that may be on the way out. But I think what's totally on the way in and has been a real hallmark of 21st century U.S. Supreme Court conservative jurisprudence is this idea of a unitary executive where the agencies themselves cannot be immunized from presidential control, but that have to really be political arms of the administration. And most of the statutes that try to immunize agencies from presidential control, that give the agencies some independence and some autonomy or some space, some distance from the White House. These are mostly statutes that are New Deal era statutes or 1960s era statutes. And the modern conservative court has a lot of hostility for those kind of statutes. And most of the modern cases pretty much say the agencies should all be political arms of the White House, and that to the extent that agencies are given any kind of autonomy or any kind of independence, that's basically a violation of the separation of powers, which puts them under the control of the president. So I think to the extent that this may look like Biden is, kind of inserting more politics into how the immigration agencies are going to run, that's really something that's not only been invited by the modern Supreme Court, it's actually been required by the modern Supreme Court.
Okay. Again, I was curious about that. I appreciate that clarification. Well, we should probably move forward over to Congress. We've talked about the presidency. We should move over to Congress and chat a little bit about a couple of different hearings that were going on. One with Merrick Garland, and then one with Dr. Anthony Fauci. One of the things is I have been keeping up, and I'm just on a meta level to start with. One of the things I have noted is the extent to which these two gentlemen have, in both sides of the political spectrum, become targets. I think Garland is a really good example of this, right? As Politico put it, he staked his career being an independent attorney general. Who nominated him to not be his own lawyer, in Biden's words, but now faces significant blowback, not just from Republicans, but from today, from Democrats. Now, and part of that is that nobody likes, who he has charged, right? So on the Republican side, we have significant issues over the handling and the length of time it took for the Hunter Biden investigation, questions about how the DOJ has dealt with kind of what has been called by Republicans the weaponization of the legal system, or the weaponization of the DOJ, meaning that in some ways Garland has been in cahoots, if you will, with, say, the New York prosecution, the New York criminal case against Trump. But then on the other hand, Democrats have had serious issues with him, including over his handling of Biden, the handling of the special prosecutor, and the release of information that seemingly doesn't paint Biden in a particularly positive light when it comes to his ability to think, cognition, conversation, which comes up significantly here. And so you almost kind of feel, on one level, you have to kind of almost feel bad for both of these gentlemen, right? They're men without countries.
Yeah.
And I do feel a bit bad on that kind of front. But I think, we're coming at it from different views. Again, clearly in, this past, on the 4th, for Garland at least, this was a chance for Republicans to really poke at him as it relates to not releasing the actual audio transcripts of the interview with Biden, given that the transcripts that were released were edited in a variety of ways. But Garland himself really pushed back. I mean, this was probably the most forceful that he's been, arguing that our job at the DOJ is to produce justice without favor. He reiterated that he's neither the president nor Congress's lawyer or prosecutor, and that their jobs are to be, quote, outside influence. So what was your takeaway? Let's start with Garland a little bit. From again, he's getting hit even in this particular committee from both Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, well, I guess, count me as one of the Democrats who hits him.
Okay.
I think he's been a disappointing attorney general, and I think my disappointment is that he's too much cowed by the Republicans, and he for instance, I'll just pick up on the issues that you already mentioned. On the issue of the Hur report. I don't even think he should have released it at all, much less released the written transcript, because it didn't produce any charges. And it actually was a political hit job on the president, the way it was written, that even though
But Garland argues it's most definitely not.
Well, I mean, all this business about his cognition, what's the purpose of writing that down if they're not going to charge him with anything?
I don't know.
Right, just to be a political hit job, right? And so I think you get a partisan Republican special counsel in there. He's looking for anything he can, find dirt on about the president. He doesn't find anything he could charge him with. And so he just writes this kind of political screed against his competence as president, which is totally not relevant to anything that is the special counsel's charge, which is whether he committed a crime. And
so let me ask you then, because I mean that is a common refrain from the left, and I'm glad that you pick up on that one. But maybe to defend Garland a little bit, I don't know. I'll play devil's advocate if nothing else, to say right. So, I mean, why would he pick somebody? I mean, what's the advantage of picking somebody to have a hit job and then to release it to be a hit job? What does Garland gain from that, especially since he's in a Democratic administration? So I guess sometimes it's a little hard. So I hear that from the left.
Yeah.
But you kind of say, but why would he do that?
Yeah, same reason he's done a lot of other stupid things, which is I think his biggest flaw as Attorney General is that he believes correctly that Bill Barr and Jeff Sessions, overtly politicized and made the Justice Department partisan, and that he believes sort of incorrectly that if he really bends over way backwards to model opposite kind of behavior, that everyone will be satisfied with that. And so, I think, putting not only the partisan that he put in charge of the Biden documents investigation, but I think much more significantly his decision to leave the Trump U.S. attorney in there in Delaware to pursue this Hunter Biden case, which is essentially a trivial and frivolous case. Even though I'm not going to say Hunter Biden's innocent, I think he probably could be convicted on these charges, but it's very similar kind of trivial charges to the ones that all the Republicans in the country are so upset that Trump was convicted of in New York, even though, Trump was even more obviously guilty of those charges. So I think letting a case that's far below the level of seriousness that the Justice Department would ever look into, just solely because there was a Trump U.S. attorney in there trying to get Hunter Biden, and Garland's like, well, I'm not going to fire a Trump U.S. attorney who's trying to get Hunter Biden.
And that's interesting. I don't want to interrupt, but I do want to kind of highlight so you can kind of respond a little bit.
Yeah.
But that, and you even made the analogy to Trump. You said, like, look, I'm not going to say he's innocent, which is, I think, the same kind of point as Republicans. But it's a nothing burger. It's not a real. It's not a statute that we even need to worry about with the public figure. Maybe even less. I mean, if you're gonna, I don't know. In some ways, you almost. I hate to say this because again, I'm not a big supporter of Trump.
Yeah.
But Hunter Biden probably needs less protection in that sense. That's a terrible word. I don't even know how to phrase that. But, less consideration since he's just the son of a president as opposed to a presidential candidate. But everything you say there sounds just like what Republicans say.
Let me finish about Garland first, and then I'll come around to talking about the Trump case and why I think it is actually more meritorious to bring, even though I think the surface connection is
the law itself is a similar one, rarely used. It's not anyway. But yeah, please.
So Garland, there were Garland allowed the Trump U.S. attorney to hold over in Delaware. He also allowed a Trump U.S. attorney to hold over in Illinois, where a number of Democratic members of the Illinois state legislature were being prosecuted. There were other cases where, even though he didn't allow Trump U.S. attorneys to hold over, there were cases against Democratic politicians, including here in Cincinnati, where we had one with 3 members of the city council that had been, that had been in the works under the Trump U.S. attorneys. And these are other kind of partisan, and I would say in Cincinnati, bogus political prosecutions. And when Garland put in his own U.S. attorneys, he forbade them from stopping those cases. So cases actually went forward with the Biden-appointed U.S. attorneys in several jurisdictions where these cases were just extension of Trump administration kind of partisan prosecutions. And in all these did that because he didn't want anyone to say he was politicizing anything. And that had the effect of allowing kind of an extension into the Biden Justice Department of a lot of kind of nakedly partisan political investigations and prosecutions that started under Bill Barr, Jeff Sessions against Democrats. I think that was wrong. And then I think the very worst thing that of all that Garland did was he delayed extremely unduly the investigations and process of bringing charges against Donald Trump in the January 6th and Mar-a-Lago cases, which now is greatly facilitating the ability of Trump to use delaying tactics and get those cases every federal case is being delayed past the election. Maybe Trump would have been able to do that anyhow, but these charges could have been brought a year and a half earlier. But Garland just sort of decided that in order to make it look like these weren't partisan, rather than investigating Trump, they were just going to start at the bottom and investigate all the people who actually broke into the Capitol on January 6th, and then let the investigations work their way up organically until they got to Trump. And what that did was it slowed it down by 2 years to get to where everybody knew it was going. And yet he got no credit whatsoever from any of the Republicans for that. Like, not a single Republican is saying, well, since Merrick Garland ran a perfectly proper investigation and started with the people who broke into the Capitol on January 6th and spent 2 years tracing it all the way up to Trump before he charged Trump, that means that this is a legitimate prosecution. No Republican said that. So all he did was kind of naively introduce undue delay for reasons that he thought would let Republicans ascribe good faith to him that none of them were ever going to ascribe anyhow.
But I mean, again, I think, as you note, that would be the normal process. But it seems like you're saying a little bit here is that the nature of Trump was such that you needed someone who would not have done normal process to get him in before the election. Again, right. I'm not trying to say that's what you're, I'm just trying to ask you. That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm hearing.
No. I don't think it was the normal process for a case like this because, in other investigations, not in this investigation, you might not know who sent those people that showed up to commit the crime on January 6th. And so the normal investigation would involve having to figure that out. But in this case, it was completely known and completely obvious from day one. So a normal investigation actually would have started at the top, not at the bottom, because everybody at the top was already completely identified and known. And I think the reason that he started at the bottom was just because he thought the optics of starting at the top would be bad. Right. Not that it was not that it was necessary in order to prove the case to start at the bottom and work the way up in this case, but just that he didn't want anyone.
Don't you think? I mean, again, as I've looked at this, it appears to me that one of the reasons he starts there at the bottom is, while on one level it appears clear that Trump is saying, like, this is what we've got to do, it's not, when you actually read the transcript, maybe as clear cut. And I think one of the reasons you potentially start at the bottom is because you want individuals on the record in their defense suggesting that I'm doing this because of Trump. And you don't get that if you go the other direction.
Well, it depends how far at the bottom and how far at the top, because there'd been plenty of newspaper reporting already, say, on the fake electors scheme and the role of John Eastman and Ken Cheeseborough and people like that.
But those are related but separate issues.
They're not. They're the same issue. That's the January 6th scheme, right? Is to disrupt the electoral count and introduce a slate of alternate electors. Right. And that is all that conduct is charged in the January 6th case indictment. And I think that's the level that you start at. And then it doesn't take as long to get to the top. Like, you really don't have to start, all the way down at the people who broke into the Capitol.
I think you do. I hear you. And I don't have, like, this isn't like some, sometimes you have deeper disagreements. But I do think you really have to establish that the individuals who are headed to the Capitol believe that they're doing it explicitly, not because of the things surrounding Trump, but because of Trump himself. And I think that is a key portion of that case. Now, I think that's a case to be made. So again, I'm not arguing.
It's not even a key portion of the indictment. Even the indictment doesn't even make that a key portion. The indictment really focuses on the role that Trump, through Roger Stone, had in organizing militias like the Proud Boys and the 3%ers and them to go over there to start the violence, even before Trump makes the speech at the Ellipse. So Trump sends, like, just a kind of a bunch of, I don't know what you call them, useful idiots who come to his speech, at the ellipse over there. But that's just to create a distraction. But Trump also organized actual, organized conspiracy that was gonna violently attack the Capitol as a means of allowing the fake elector plot to disrupt the vote count. And all of that is charged in the indictment. And all of the important parts of that don't even relate to the speech at the ellipse or to the mob that went over there who wasn't part of that conspiracy. So I don't think he needed that much about that. And, those people, could have been independently, identified and arrested. And ultimately, if a Trump case was going forward, maybe some of them would have at that point tried to offer to be cooperators in exchange for lenience, but they didn't need to delay investigating the organizers of the plot, while they were investigating the lowest level. And I don't think that he did that because he thought that was necessary as a in order to litigate successfully. I think he did that all because he thought it was very important that he present optics to the country that show that he wasn't starting out trying to investigate Trump, but that he was just kind of starting out at the bottom and following the evidence trails where they went. And it was really the optics of that motivated that decision. But it accomplished nothing.
I don't want to completely move us, but I do want to move us along a little bit because obviously we also had Dr. Fauci's testimony this week on June 3rd as well. And as we kind of set this up, this is another individual like Garland who was very much a target of certain portions of the Republican Party and the right as kind of being fake science, you might say, and now more recently has really taken a hit from Democrats, I think especially as it relates to his use of funding, his downplay of the lab leak hypothesis, and social distancing, especially as it relates to kiddos in public education, is where on the left he has taken specific hits, and that's a big part of the his testimony before the House committee this past June 3rd. And then from the right, I think he continues to take a hits on vaccines and more systemic issues that they see with his interaction. Again, I think also with the lab leak. But those are kind of some of the big issues. And one of the main items that came up this past week was a lot of conversation about the 6 feet social distancing recommendation, which he says just, quote, sort of just appeared, end quote, without robust empirical support. And that's one of the major issues here. And I really want to leave aside, because I think that part was just a sideshow. You have Green doing her normal sideshow things as Mr. Fauci and that kind of crap. But, but on these particular issues, it seems to move that way. And I think the one, and this is one we had talked about a little bit earlier on, was he does seem to have early really wanted to downplay the possibility that there was any connection between COVID-19 and the study of these kinds of viruses in China, and any potential connection between federal dollars and those. And here on the 4th, he acknowledged that it should not be dismissed as a conspiracy theory. And I know that was one that we had even talked about on the show a little bit. So what are your thoughts on Fauci then?
Well, I like Fauci, but I think obviously he wasn't right about everything, right? And so first,
in other words, you don't have quite the same negativity you have towards Garland on that front.
No, I think Fauci was always in good faith, and it was a very difficult position that he was in. The COVID pandemic was killing millions of people.
Well, it ends up killing 1.1 million as of now.
Americans and 25 million people on Earth. And,
yes. And again, you can't really think of him as being even the face for the whole world, right? You can't lay that at him.
But no, I'm not. But I'm saying he had to try to figure out, always based on extremely imperfect knowledge and imperfect science.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah. I thought you were kind of laying more, and he was like, well, the whole world was. I'm like, well, come on.
No, the opposite. I was saying I like him, and I'm saying the fact that he didn't get everything right in real time, I think, is inevitable. Nobody in that situation could get everything right in real time, and I think he was always acting in good faith, based on what he thought was the best available information, the best available science, and also erring on the side of caution. And in terms of the lab leak, yeah, you and I did talk about it before. And at that point in time, I thought it was impossible to know. And I think you were a little bit more thinking evidence was pointing towards the lab leak,
or at least the possibility of it.
Possibility. Yeah. Now I'm totally. I do believe the case is becoming more and more proved that it was much more likely a lab leak than any other explanation that we heard. But again, in real time, I don't think that could have been known. Most of the type of studies, I saw there was a big study that came out of MIT just last week. This wasn't available years ago. Where they tried to trace under the animal theory, which would have been that it came from this animal market. I guess the animals that were being sold at the animal market, their native habitat was like 1,000 miles away. And so, you would have expected to see cases of the disease along the path, that those animals had to have been moved from their native habitat 1,000 miles away to the market where they were sold in Wuhan. And you would have expected to see some cases developing in the area of their native habitat, contemporaneously with when cases were developing in Wuhan. And that study got completed, and you don't see any of that stuff, which I think is, some kind of reasonable evidence that the lab leak seems more likely. And now I think it's more likely, but I also think it wasn't knowable back then. And the studies that are kind of proving it are taking years to complete. And
no, I agree with you overall. I agree with you overall that I think that he was dealing with the information he had, and I really think, especially the attack he gets on the 6 feet apart, downplays the fact that you have a brand new kind of virus. And although they think that it's aerosol spread at the beginning for a lot of really good reasons, that it's not until later that it moves kind of to the droplet or to the 3 feet distance. And I think this is one of those things, as a scientist, I can say, well, look, it's not as if, if tomorrow, let's imagine tomorrow we have some radical change to Article 2 in the presidency, right? I don't know, we pass some, constitutional amendment. It's not as if political scientists could 1 week later tell you, here is precisely what's going to happen, right? We would need some time to do that. And I mean, again, obviously a different kind of field. And likewise, I think a lot of the issue on vaccine mandates and that is really linked. I think the reason that my friends on the left are particularly frustrated with him is they're frustrated by what happened in public education. And I would actually argue there that if the biggest thing that we learned from the pandemic when it came to education is how, and this is something that I think every educator who has ever lived, who is a real educator, agrees on, and I will 100%, here it is that virtual education by its very nature is terrible.
Yeah.
And that had nothing to do with Fauci, right? That's not him, right? That's a whole different go. Really, the only thing that I kind of push back a little bit on with what you were saying there, Ken, is yes, we did have some confirming evidence that just came out about the possibility of a lab leak. But as somebody, again, I am not a scientist on that side, but there was clear evidence of that as a possibility. I don't want to say clear evidence, much earlier than that. And I think that was one that was done for optics and ought not to have been done. Now, had he not done that, would that have suddenly given him more credibility all the way around? Probably not. But that is the one item that I will hold him to a little bit. But otherwise, I agree with you, but I think that was one area where, no, I mean, do we have, I read the study you were talking about, and again, what was that like? It wasn't even a month ago.
Right.
But that was not the first time that we had some pretty clear evidence on that, especially considering what we know about the different levels of lab precautions in China versus the rest of the world. But okay, I'll pause there on that.
I think about that, though, I'll just say, I think my position at the time was similar to what you were saying his should have been. Like I always said, we don't know. And I never excluded the idea of a lab leak.
No, you did. But he certainly did.
But I think part of the reason that he was right to downplay it was because it was so clearly being wielded in bad faith by the House Republicans. And, the concept of the lab leak was so linked to the concept of falsely blaming him personally for this whole thing happening, which is just ridiculous. I think that he really was pushed in a position that he had to downplay it some. And I don't think he ever denied it. He just downplayed it. And I just quickly also wanted to say on the distancing,
he did
and on
call
the
it a conspiracy theory. So I'm not sure.
Did he?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, I think that is too strong of language for it. If he would have said things like there's not the evidence for it, I think that was true at the time, although I think the evidence for it has probably been established by now. But I agree, it's not right to call it a conspiracy theory. On the distancing, yeah, even though I guess now we might know more about the way it's transmitted than we knew then, like 3 feet versus 6 feet, in a state of imperfect knowledge, I think it's definitely better to be safe than sorry.
Exactly.
On that.
Exactly.
And in fact, it's not that different than a lot of forms of regulation. Like I'll use the highways again. We have these speed limits up there that are 55 or 65 or whatever. And there's no strong evidence that those are the right numbers, right? I mean, it's obvious that the faster people drive, the more dangerous it's going to be. The slower people drive, the safer it's going to be. But in terms of like, should you draw the line at 55 or 65 or 75? There's not strong evidence for those exact numbers. And you just have to at some point say, since we know that, if everyone was driving like 100 miles an hour, that would be very dangerous. We're going to have to draw a line somewhere. And I feel like that's a reasonable enough, the 6 foot was a reasonable enough line to draw. And although I also want to say with hindsight on the schools, and maybe this was apparent even at the time at the schools, it was disastrous for children to be out of school for that year. But we were really in such a state, again, of imperfect knowledge, including, teachers were terrified too. And if you would have tried to keep
rightfully so.
Yeah. If you would have tried to keep all the schools open, it was going to be easier said than done. If the government would have said, well, what we now probably know is that kids probably suffered more from being out of school for a year than they would have, from the possible exposure to each other if they'd been in school. But even if that was known then, a lot of the general public, adult general public, would be, wasn't going to work, and school teachers, I think, would have been, well, I'm not going to go to work and risk my life for this kind of low-paying, thankless job. When all these
well,
people.
And I think that is an absolutely excellent point. Is that one of the things I think even now that gets overlooked, both left and right on that, and I'll talk about it in terms of an immunocompromised individual, and I'm not even that old. Is that okay? So even if my students, and this even holds true right now, right? My students get the flu, no big deal for them, right?
Right.
It's going to be all good. But I get the flu, and that is likely. I can tell you, it's a lot of medicine, and it's likely a visit to the hospital. And that has nothing to do with just COVID-19. And so I do think sometimes when you think about that, everybody says, well, the kids would have been fine. Okay, maybe they would have been. But what about the 60-year-old, the 50-year-old, the 40-year-old teen? Which, again, I think we sometimes downplay those adult deaths.
Right.
Again, over 1 million people so far. It still kills more people than the flu, even this past set of cycles on it, right? And I think that we've just kind of lost a little bit of sight of that. So I think the biggest item, I agree with you, remote learning is just, regardless of age, whatever age you are, it's terrible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to risk their lives to make that potentially happen.
Or even that they would have if you told all the school teachers, school's still open, you need to come in and do your job. Every other adult on your street is like not going in to do their job, but you're going to come in and do your job. I think it wouldn't have worked, And so those are all realities that Fauci was up against. I think he made the best use of information that was available to him at the time. I think he was diligent and took the job seriously and always tried to do the right thing. And the fact that we can Monday morning quarterback and say, now we know a few things that he got wrong, really means really very little to me in terms of how I think about him.
No, I agree. Like I said, I have taken only one exception really there. Well, Ken, goodness, we have gone longer than we anticipated. So I'm going to need to pause us there and thank you So if you're listening to this show, just remember there is a way to get it and get even more fun things. And that's by heading to patreon.com/politicsguys. And what do those kind of things include? Well, you're going to have access to our Politics Guys Discord group. Man, I was doing a bunch of stuff on that yesterday. I'm going to be doing some more today. I love interacting with individuals on there. That's always a lot of fun. It also means getting things like this show ad-free. Yeah, that's a lot of fun too. And it means you get access to things like our midweek supporter show. And what Ken and I do for that supporter show, we have been going through the U.S. Constitution. As a matter of fact, we're finishing up the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, that is, here on our upcoming midweek show. So there's all kinds of really cool things that you get by being a supporter. So again, head to patreon.com/politicsguys, and you can take a look at all the different levels of support and pick the one that worked for you. There's other ways to support the show. That includes Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. And you can also support the show through PayPal. All of those links are in the show notes. Or if you want to head to it on a web browser, point it to politicsguys.com/support. Now, if you're like me and you're not in that easy financial position, but you'd still like to get our midweek show, there's a way to make that happen. Just reach out at mail@politicsguys.com and we can get you set up. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, rate, and review us on the podcast app of your choice, or preferably all of them. Yeah, that's absolutely the way you're going to get the most visibility, is the ability to be high up on those rankings. I know you hear this all the time. Every app in the world is saying, rate me. But it means the world if you can do that. And it's also really important if you'll share this or any other episode on social media and tell us why and add us. So again, all of our ways of getting a hold of us include mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and X, and you're going to find all of those links in the show notes. Please add us anytime you're posting things. A special, as always, shout out to the people who make the Politics Guys possible, and that are our executive producers. And they are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode this next week, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,